When I moved into Sycamore Springs, I had no idea I was stepping into a battlefield. The neighborhood was picture perfect. Rows of pastel-colored houses, freshly mowed lawns, and a picturesque cul-de-sac where kids rode their bikes in blissful ignorance of the tyranny that lurked among them. It wasn't until I decided to install a simple picket fence that I met my arch-nemesis, Karen. Karen wasn't just any HOA worker. No, she was the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood's so-called charm. With her ever-present clipboard, aggressively short blonde bob, and the permanent expression of someone who had just smelled sour milk, she embodied every HOA horror story I'd ever heard. She wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was the rules. And the moment she laid eyes on my fence, her lips pursed like she had tasted something bitter. "You do realize," she said, arms crossed, "that all exterior modifications must be approved by the HOA? I looked at my fence. Standard white picket, perfectly aligned with the aesthetics of every other house on the block. "I checked the bylaws before installing it," I replied, maintaining my politest tone. "It meets the requirements." Karen let out a scoff so sharp I swore it could slice glass. "Oh, sweetie, just because you think it meets the requirements doesn't mean it actually does." She tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail. "You didn't submit a formal request, and without prior approval, this is considered an unauthorized structure." I blinked. "It's a fence." Karen gave me a condescending smile that screamed, "I live for this power trip." "Yes, and unauthorized structures lead to fines. We can't have people just doing whatever they want, now can we?" And so the battle began. At first, her resistance seemed almost laughable. It started with minor inconveniences, passive-aggressive. Notes taped to my door, written in bold, aggressive cursive. "Your fence disrupts the neighborhood harmony. Please correct this before further action is required." The next day, I found a notice stuffed in my mailbox stating that my fence was 1/4 inch too high. Then another note arrived. "Your fence is painted in an unapproved shade of white." That one nearly broke me. I tried reasoning with her, pointing out that multiple homes had the exact same fence, the exact same color, and the exact same dimensions. But reasoning with Karen was like reasoning with a cat. She simply ignored facts that weren't convenient to her worldview. And then came the fines. Oh, the fines. First, a $50 unauthorized modification fee. Then, a $200 non-compliance penalty. Within a month, I was drowning in absurd charges, each more ridiculous than the last. My favorite? A $75 fee for disturbing the visual peace of the community. That one made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. But what started as an inconvenience soon turned into a full-blown vendetta. Karen wasn't just issuing fines, she was actively escalating the situation. One morning, I woke up to find an official HOA letter taped to my front door. The bold, all-caps heading read, "Final warning, imminent eviction." Notice I stood there, coffee cup in hand, staring at the words as the absurdity of the situation washed over me. Karen wasn't just trying to make my life difficult. She was trying to run me out of the neighborhood. For a brief moment, I considered cutting my losses. Was it worth the stress, the frustration, the constant back and forth with a woman who clearly had nothing better to do than wage a one-woman war against a picket fence? Then I smiled. Because what Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to check, was that I wasn't just some clueless homeowner. I was a property lawyer, and I wasn't going down without a fight. I sat down at my desk, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. If Karen wanted to play hardball, she had no idea what she was in for. The first step was simple. I gathered every piece of correspondence, every passive-aggressive note, every fine, every so-called violation she had sent my way. I scanned the HOA's bylaws from cover to cover like a general mapping out a battle strategy. As I flipped through the legal jargon, something became abundantly clear. Karen had been enforcing more than just the rules. She had been enforcing, her interpretation of them stretching vague clauses to justify her absurd vendetta. For example, the fence height regulation. The bylaws stated fences couldn't exceed 4 feet. Mine was exactly that, exactly 4 feet. The paint color? The rules simply said fences had to be neutral and harmonious with the aesthetic of the community. White. I had used white. Unless. Karen had suddenly decided that white wasn't neutral anymore. I was completely within my rights. The fines, though, that's where things got interesting. I found no legitimate clause supporting the absurd visual peace penalty. In fact, most of the fines she levied weren't authorized by any section of the HOA charter. They were arbitrary, plucked from thin air, and shoved into official-looking letters to intimidate me. I spent hours compiling a meticulous defense, documenting each instance where Karen had stepped beyond her authority. I highlighted clauses, printed out HOA guidelines, and annotated her violations with legal notes like a professor correcting a particularly foolish student's essay. But I wasn't going to stop at just defending myself. No, I was going to make sure Karen's entire regime of pettiness collapsed around her. I researched HOA abuse cases, found legal precedents, and drafted letters that could make even the most overzealous board member sweat bullets. 2 days later, it was time for my first move. I mailed a formal complaint to the HOA board, the actual board, not Karen's power-drunk version of it. I laid out every infraction she had committed against me, complete with legal citations and evidence that would make a courtroom clerk weep with joy. But just to really twist the knife, I CC'd the County Housing Authority. Nothing makes a tyrant sweat faster than realizing someone with actual power is now paying attention. The next day, as I sipped my coffee and admired my perfectly legal fence, I spotted her, Karen, marching down the street like a storm cloud in orthopedic shoes, clipboard, clutched so tightly in her claws that her knuckles were practically glowing white. She wore that signature smirk, a twisted little reminder that she thought she was untouchable. She stopped at my mailbox and slid something inside. Then she turned, locked eyes with me, and smiled. That smug, self-satisfied smile. I waited until she rounded the corner before I checked the mailbox. Another violation notice, this time for unsanctioned decorative plants lining my walkway. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. But instead of getting angry, I laughed. It was time for round 2. That afternoon, I wrote a letter addressed directly to Karen, polite, formal, coded in the kind of professionalism that cuts sharper than any insult. I pointed out that her recent violations had no legal basis, and that continued harassment could result in legal action for abuse of authority. And harassment. I made sure to mention that I was a property lawyer, specializing in housing law. I didn't send it by mail. I hand-delivered it. The next morning I caught her just as she was inspecting someone else's mailbox, no doubt finding another reason to unleash her petty wrath. "Karen," I called out cheerfully. She turned around, clearly not expecting me to engage. Her expression was already shifting into that familiar condescending mask. "Oh, hello. I trust you've received my latest notice?" I handed her the letter with a pleasant smile that could freeze fire. "Oh, I did, and here's something for you." She took it, eyes narrowing suspiciously as she scanned the first few lines. Watching her face drop as she hit the part where I mentioned my profession. Chef's kiss. "I think you'll find," I added casually, "that your recent actions could have serious consequences if pursued through the proper channels." Her mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since our interactions began, Karen looked rattled. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, I received an official letter, not from Karen, but from the actual HOA board. The tone was markedly different. Apologetic, even. They were reviewing recent enforcement actions taken by an HOA representative and assured me that my concerns were being taken seriously. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Karen wasn't done. The escalation hit its peak when I received a formal eviction notice, this time issued by Karen herself. It was laughably illegal, riddled with errors that would make any lawyer's eye twitch. But the fact that she dared to push things this far meant she wasn't just power-tripping. She was convinced she was invincible. That was her mistake. I didn't just respond. I launched a full-on legal complaint through the County Housing Board. I filed for an official investigation into Karen's conduct, citing harassment, abuse of authority, and misuse of HOA powers. I backed it with documented evidence, witness statements from neighbors who had also suffered under her rule but had been too afraid to speak out until now. Word spread fast. Neighbors started coming forward. People I barely knew, now emboldened by the legal action I'd taken. One after another, stories poured in. Unfair fines, sudden threats of foreclosure for minor landscaping, infractions, absurd fees for things as petty as improper mailbox placement. Karen had built an empire of fear, and now it was collapsing. Could feel the shift in the air whenever I walked down the street. People smiled, waved, stopped to thank me. The neighborhood wasn't just siding with me, they were rallying. But I wasn't finished yet. The showdown was coming. And when it did, Karen wouldn't just lose her clipboard. She'd lose the iron grip she had on Sycamore Springs altogether. The storm finally broke at the next HOA meeting, a gathering that, under normal circumstances, was about as exciting as watching paint dry on beige walls. But this wasn't just any meeting. This was the meeting, the one where Karen's paper crown would either tighten or crumble into dust. I arrived early, dressed not in battle armor but in something far more intimidating. A crisp, perfectly tailored suit, the kind that screamed, "I know the law better than you know your own reflection." The room was already filling with neighbors, more than I'd ever seen attend one of these dull gatherings. Word had spread. People who had once cowered under Karen's thumb now sat upright, their expressions sharp with anticipation. At the front of the room, Karen stood with her ever-present clipboard, dressed in her signature cardigan set, wearing that brittle, condescending smile she had perfected over years of small-time tyranny. But there was something off about her, an unfamiliar tightness around her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty in her posture. Maybe it was the growing crowd. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, she wasn't holding all the cards. The HOA board sat at the long table in front, shuffling papers, casting nervous glances toward the swelling audience. They knew why everyone was here. The investigation had already begun. Complaints had piled up like a mountain they could no longer ignore, and Karen, whether she realized it yet or not, was standing on the edge of that crumbling peak. The meeting began with the usual procedural nonsense, but I didn't hear any of it. My focus was razor-sharp, locked on the moment my name was called for the community concerns segment. Next up, the chairperson said, adjusting his glasses nervously, "We have, Mr. Thompson regarding recent enforcement concerns." I stood slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone feel the weight of the moment. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady, professional, but with just enough edge to cut through the tension in the room. "I want to address not just my own experiences with this HOA's enforcement policies, but also those of many neighbors here today who've been subjected to arbitrary, inconsistent, and frankly, unlawful actions." Karen shifted uncomfortably. In her seat, I laid out everything, every fine, every fabricated infraction, every ounce of harassment I and others had endured under Karen's so-called leadership. Each point was backed with evidence, emails, letters, official documents, even testimonies from neighbors who had suffered quietly for years. "Furthermore," I said, locking eyes with Karen, "these actions are not only morally reprehensible, but legally questionable. I've submitted a formal complaint to the County Housing Board, and they've launched an investigation into abuse of authority and possible financial misconduct within the HOA's enforcement practices." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's face paled, her carefully applied makeup failing to hide the sudden panic flooding her features. But I wasn't done. "And just so we're clear," I added, voice sharpening like a blade, "if anyone here has faced similar mistreatment, you're not alone. There are legal avenues available to every single one of you." That was the tipping point. One by one, my neighbors began to speak up. People I barely knew, retirees, young couples, single parents, all stood and shared their stories. Fines for leaving Halloween decorations up a day too long, warnings for excessive noise during family gatherings, threats of foreclosure over supposed landscaping violations. Karen sat frozen, the color draining from her cheeks with each new testimony. The once invincible tyrant of Sycamore Springs now looked like a woman drowning in her own lies, gasping for control in a room that had turned entirely against her. And then came the final blow. The HOA chair cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Karen Walters," he began, voice shaky but firm. "Given the evidence presented and the ongoing investigation, we're placing you on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the inquiry." The room erupted, not with chaos, but with a wave of relieved murmurs. It wasn't just my victory. It was our victory. Karen tried to speak, tried to reclaim that familiar air of superiority, but her voice cracked under the pressure. The clipboard, her scepter of authority, trembled in her hands. "You can't do this. I was just following the rules?" I cut in, voice calm but laced with steel. "No, Karen. You were following your rules, and that ends today." The chair nodded. "Please leave the premises, Ms. Walters." For a moment she just sat there. Then, slowly, she stood, stiff and mechanical, and left without another word, clutching her clipboard like it was the last thing keeping her upright. And just like that, the reign of terror was over. In the weeks that followed, Sycamore Springs transformed. The board restructured the HOA's policies, throwing out Karen's absurd fines and rewriting the rules to actually serve the community, not strangle it. Neighbors who had once hidden behind closed blinds now gathered freely, organizing. Barbecues, community cleanups, and holiday events. The fence? It stayed up, white, perfect, and completely within regulation. But karma wasn't finished with Karen yet. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that after the investigation, she was not only removed from her HOA position, but also fined for misusing HOA funds and abusing her authority. Her reputation in the community was ruined. And the best part? Rumor had it that Karen had found herself a new job, working at the county permit office. Every day she now had to deal with stacks of paperwork and approval processes from people just like the ones she used to terrorize. Poetic justice in its purest form. As for me, life settled back into the peaceful suburban quiet I'd hoped for when I first moved in. My neighbors and I grew closer, no longer held hostage by ridiculous fines or petty power trips. We even hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my front yard, fence proudly standing in the background. Sycamore Springs finally felt like home, and every time I passed by the HOA office I couldn't help but smile. Because Karen's clipboard, it was gone, and the neighborhood was better for it.